Well, welcome to our monthly webinar for Legal Services Alabama. We are very excited to present today on representing clients with criminal court debt. We've started the broadcast a little bit early because we know from experience that people will have tech issues or sound issues, stuff like that. And so we go ahead and start it early. So we will actually kick the presentation off with our speakers at noon. But in the meantime, just want to make sure everything's working and that everyone's system is working. If you have problems during the presentation, there should be a bar off to the side that allows you to ask questions. I'll be able to see them. Our IT guy will be able to see them. And if you have questions as things are going on, feel free to let us know. If there's problems, we can fix them. If you can't hear things or if the video isn't working, we certainly want to know about it while the presentation's going on so we can fix it rather than waiting to the end and just finding out that you missed half it. In the meantime, and I do want to stress that I think that both the speakers would really love any questions, and so as you're going along, just feel free to ask and someone here will read them to them. We don't have the availability to do audio, but certainly we've done this in the past and it works. In the couple of minutes we have before we get started, I did want to tell everyone a little bit about Legal Services Alabama. Legal Services Alabama is the statewide free law firm for low-income people. We help about 11,000 people every year, but we basically stick to 5 main areas. We do consumer law, housing law, family law, public benefits law, and education law. So anything that falls outside of those, we really don't get into. We don't do much probate, a lot of different things, which is why we like doing these sessions where we can talk to the private attorneys and ask them to consider volunteering. Alabama has a wonderful volunteer lawyer program system. There are 5 volunteer lawyer programs. I had to count them for a second. There are 5 volunteer lawyer programs around the state. There's one for each of the major big cities, Mobile, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Huntsville. And then there's the Alabama State Bar Volunteer Lawyer Program, which will cover the rest of the state. I can't stress enough, Legal Services does about 11,000 cases a year, but there are about 1 million people living below the poverty line in Alabama, 1.7 to 1.8 million people living below 200% of the poverty line. And really, I think anyone watching this, any lawyer in the state would understand if you're making $40,000 a year with a family of 4, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to afford a lawyer to save up for some big things. And they have a really deep need and sometimes very urgent need just to save houses and food, just kind of keep the family stable, which is where we hope you come in and we'll consider stepping in with your talents and also meeting, I think it's, I don't want to guess, I think Rule 1.6, but it could be there's definitely a rule of professional conduct which says that lawyers should consider giving their talents pro bono for needy people. And so we offer these sessions in hope of finding something that you would have a passion for and something that you'd be consider volunteering for. But really, whether it's criminal court debt, some people that may not be what they want to do, but there are so many different needs. You can sign up with the volunteer lawyer programs, tell them what you're willing to do, and they will find you clients who need your help. It's really a minimal time commitment. I think they ask about 20 hours a year or 2 cases. And I understand when you're making a living that's a lot, but it's so much more important to the people that we help. I've done this my entire career, and I can't tell you how enjoyable it is to help people who really need it, who appreciate it, and without getting your services, they can suffer horribly. They become homeless. I've unfortunately seen bad results, but with your help, with your support, certainly we can do that. Before we get started, I also wanted to talk just a moment about an initiative we have here at Legal Services Alabama, which is kind of one of the reasons we have this session on criminal court debt. We've received a grant from the Southern Poverty Law Center and it'll be funding a full-time attorney at Legal Services, at least for the next 3 years, whose job it will be to basically travel the state of Alabama and handle these criminal court debt issues, going into municipal court and the local state courts, and trying to resolve some criminal court debt issues. So we are accepting applications through Friday for that job. If you or anybody you know thinks they'd be interested in that job, you can find out more on our website, or you can email an application in at jobs@alsp.org. Once again, for the folks joining us late, we'll start in about 3 minutes. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, representing clients with criminal court debt. I'm really excited about this issue. I think it's a big issue affecting the state. Again, is presented by Legal Services Alabama. We have partnered with the solo and small firm section of the Alabama State Bar to help in presenting these things, and with our volunteer lawyer program partners. We enjoy presenting these every month for the legal community, and we get great feedback. If you're just joining us, I repeat myself mostly because we started early, and I can never tell when people join. I know a lot of folks show up. We're lawyers, and so we all show up probably right on time or even slightly late. I think that's part of the profession. But wanted to again encourage anybody who's watching, if they don't already volunteer with the volunteer lawyer programs, to consider doing that. It's really easy. Really the easiest way to do it is just either call the Alabama State Bar or go on the Alabama State Bar website. There's a link. You can tell them that you want to volunteer, and they will just send you to the appropriate entity, because there are 5 volunteer lawyer programs in the state. And again, it's a very minimal contribution. It's 20 hours a year. Although from what I've heard from a lot of folks, is once you do it, it really is so enjoyable, and it's so meaningful, and it adds so much depth to your practice, that a lot of people do more. And if you want to have a new way to learn a topic that you may be able to eventually incorporate into your practice or get training, get experience as a new lawyer, it's a great way to get started, and it's a great way to help people too. Okay, we are about 1 minute away from starting. So I will go ahead and start with the introduction. I'm going to let the speakers largely tell you about themselves. I've known them both for years, one of them almost for 2 decades. So I'm really proud to introduce Leah Nelson from the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Did I get the whole title right? Yeah, that's great. And Leah's got a biography, which I knew some of the places she'd worked. It's on the email. I'll let her tell you about it. But I've known Leah for a couple of years, and she's great. And she's going to do a talk about a report that Appleseed did regarding court debt. And then Martha Morgan, who was actually my con law professor back at Alabama. Professor Morgan was a professor at Alabama for years and years. But more recently has done a lot of pro bono work and helping with needy communities. I'll let her tell you about that. I will say that there was certainly no quid pro quo with Professor Morgan, because I did remind her this morning that she did give me a C in con law. So this is certainly, she's been introduced here more on her merits than any particular love I have for her class. With that being said, I'll hand the podium off, and remember that if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. If you have questions about audio, visual, go ahead and type them in, and we'll deal with them as we can as the session progresses. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, Michael.
Yes, I would just add that I was very young when we knew each other 20 years ago. But you go first.
I'm Leah Nelson. I'm research director with the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. We are a small public policy organization. We're based in Old Alabama Town, and we mostly do work at the intersection of poverty and the criminal justice system, or the justice system more generally. I'm going to say at the front end, I have a journalism background. I am not a lawyer, so please, any questions about like lawyer stuff rather than background information stuff should be directed at Professor Morgan because I am not the one. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of context for the presentation that Professor Morgan's going to give on representing clients with criminal court debt. My presentation is based on findings from this report, which I was the principal author of, but would not have happened without Legal Services of Alabama, along with Greater Birmingham Ministries and TASC, which is the amazing community corrections program out of Birmingham. We all got together. We got a grant from the Annie E. Casey Foundation to look at how court debt is a driver of Alabama's racial wealth gap. And for this report, Under Pressure, How Fines and Fees Hurt People, Undermine Public Safety, and Drive Alabama's Racial Wealth Divide, we surveyed 980 people across the state about their experience with court debt. That was 879 people who were paying their own debt or who owed their own debt. Some of them were not actually able to pay it. And then 101 people who were only paying debt that had been accrued by other people. So the 101 people tended overwhelmingly to be middle-aged African-American women who were paying debt for sons or husbands or other family members. That was a particularly devastating finding of this report because while everybody else their age were, paying down mortgages or helping kids with college or down payments on homes and all the things that middle-aged people like to do with their lives, maybe taking vacations, these middle-aged African-American women were saddled with court debt that had been accrued by family members. And of course, the 879 people that we surveyed were also overwhelmed by what they owed. So what is the racial wealth gap? Very quickly, wealth is the measure of the totality of the assets a person owns minus any debt that they owe. So even two people who have the exact same income can have very different amounts of wealth depending on factors like inheritance and debt. In Alabama and everywhere in the United States, there is a wealth gap between Black and white populations. In 2011, and I'm just going to say we don't have wealth gap data for Alabama specifically, it just does not exist. So I need to use nationwide data for this. In 2011, a typical white family in America that was in the bottom quintile of earnings, so that was people earning less than $19,000 or families earning less than $19,000 annually, those white families owned $15,000 in wealth, in assets. A typical African-American family earning the same amount owned just $100 in wealth. That is a shocking, shocking gap. And due to the difference in median household net worth between the races, the median Latino or Black household would have to save nearly 100% of its income for 3 years in a row to close the gap between Black and white families in the bottom quintile of earners. Overall, looking at household wealth across America, Black families have a nationwide median of $11,000 in net worth compared to $134,000 held by white families. So that's kind of the background. That's the wealth gap. It's much, much more than the income gap. It's almost silly to talk about causes of Alabama's racial wealth gap because they are so well known, but let's go through them anyway. There is obviously the history of slavery. After that, convict labor effectively led to the re-enslavement of Black people who were accused of minor crimes like panhandling, and many of those crimes were selectively enforced. So panhandling was illegal for everyone, but only Black people were arrested for it, and then they were re-enslaved and forced to work as convict laborers, often for incredibly long periods of time, often dying in the process of doing that. And anybody who's interested in learning about that history, I highly, highly recommend Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. It is an amazing book that is kind of crushing to read, but a very worthwhile read. So there were other things after convict labor died down, although we still use it here. Redlining and local ordinances that made it impossible for Black families to buy homes in nice neighborhoods and to accumulate wealth through home equity were a major factor that continues to drive the racial wealth gap. And then, of course, Jim Crow laws and the exclusion of Black people from universities and high earning professions made it very hard for generations of Black people to accumulate wealth. And those are just a handful of the many, many, many historical factors that have conspired to keep African Americans in Alabama on average poorer than white people here. It's just historically been a lot harder for African American families to accumulate wealth. And there are present day causes as well, one of which is court debt. So one of the big factors that drives all of this is over-policing of African American communities and people. African Americans make up 54% of Alabama's prison population, but only 27% of the state's population. And they're overrepresented in jails in this state at about the same rate. So I got data with help from the Southern Poverty Law Center on all of the arrests from 2016, and we looked at the racial disparities in arrests. So for the top 20 charges that people were charged with that year, so the top 20 most common charges in 2016, African Americans were more than twice as likely as white people to be arrested for 6 of those. And the greatest disparity in those top 20 arrests was in arrests for possession of marijuana. In 2016, Black people were more than 4 times as likely as white people to be arrested for possession of marijuana. This is not because Black people use marijuana at a higher rate. We know from decades and decades of research that's conducted by the federal government and everybody agrees on that Black and white people use marijuana at roughly the same rate. If they use it at the same rate, they possess it at the same rate. There is no reason for Black people to be arrested more for possession of marijuana. There were other offenses that caused major disparities, and several of those also rest on the perception of the arresting officer. So African Americans in 2016 were 3.7 times as likely as white people to be arrested for disorderly conduct in Alabama. They were 2.3 times as likely as white people to be arrested for trespassing, and that can include stuff like remaining in a restaurant or other public accommodation after you've been asked to leave. So you can imagine how that would transpire. And they were twice as likely to be arrested for resisting an officer and contempt of court as white people in 2016 in Alabama. Convictions for all of those offenses come with fines and fees. So fines and fees are disproportionately visited on people of color who are disproportionately likely to be poor for all of the reasons that I talked about earlier. And that is the crux of this report, which is on Alabama Appleseed's website. And I would love for you to look at.
We also have a handout on it.
And it's a handout. Wow, you have it. All right, so the survey population I described earlier, it was people across the state who owed court debt mostly for themselves, but a very small handful of them, or about a tenth of them who only owed it for other people or were helping other people. On this survey, which you can find in its totality at the end of the report, there were a lot of questions about people's financial circumstances. We asked about employment. We asked whether they were on public benefits, whether they had access to cash, whether they'd ever been found indigent in court, basically trying to get a picture of whether they were poor, and overwhelmingly they were. But specifically for indigent people, we found that people who had at some point been found indigent by a court and qualified to receive appointed counsel, by nearly every measure, they fared worse in all of the measures that we looked at than people who had never been found indigent in a court. They were less likely to be offered diversion programs or to be able to stay in diversion programs. They were more likely to have had the amount that they owed increased because they couldn't pay it. They were more likely to be threatened with jail. They were more likely to be jailed for non-payment of court debt. They were more likely to have taken out a high-cost loan like a payday loan or a title loan to pay their court debt, and they were more likely to have lost their driver's licenses in connection with their court debt. And so here are kind of the numbers. Of the people I surveyed, both indigent and non-indigent, more than 8 in 10 of these people had given up necessities like rent, food, medical bills, car payments, or child support to pay their court debt. Nearly half of the folks I surveyed said they had been jailed for failure to pay court debt. 44% of them had used payday loans to cover court debt. 8 in 10 had borrowed money from a friend or a family member to pay what they owed. Almost 2/3 of them received money or food assistance from a faith-based charity or church that they would not have had to request if they had not owed court debt. So this is a burden on churches and faith communities as well. Almost 4 in 10 of the people that I surveyed admitted to having committed at least one crime to pay off their court debt. The most common offense was selling drugs. The second most common was theft. And the third most common that people admitted in this survey was sex work. They also admitted to passing bad checks, gambling, robbery, selling food stamps, and selling stolen items. I think for me, one of the most shocking findings of this report was that almost 1 in 5 of the folks whose court debt only came from violations like driving with a busted headlight and driving with a suspended license, so people who hadn't even committed a misdemeanor. Almost 20% of those people admitted that they had gone on to commit a crime to pay off their traffic debt. So we are actually we are encouraging crime with these onerous debts because people are afraid of being jailed and they are desperate to pay them off and they do what they have to. This is a stupid system. Almost half of the people I surveyed said that they didn't think they would ever be able to pay what they owed. And nearly the same number said they would have no access to cash if they had to get out of jail today. The median amount they owed was $2,700. This is not a huge amount of money unless it's a huge amount of money to you. I mean, it is, but it's not like, we're not talking about $13,000, $20,000. You know, $2,700 was what people owed on median, and the mean, because we had some outliers who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars, was $6,500. So court debt creates a lot of externalities, and those keep people back. The biggest external impact that I found in this survey was that about 45% of the people I surveyed had lost their driver's licenses because they were unable to pay what they owed. And people who didn't have licenses faced more difficulties in making payments than people who kept them. My research also found that Montgomery and other parts of Alabama, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone, have really poor public transportation options, poor to none, right? If you're in rural Alabama, there are no buses. And that's why it's so important to keep a license, to get and keep employment. Without your license, it's almost impossible to keep a job and earn money to pay your court debt. And yet 45% of the people I surveyed had their license suspended because they couldn't pay. There are also external factors beyond how individual courts treat people that affect people's ability to pay what they owe. So this was one of the more frustrating findings, is that jurisdictions don't talk to each other about the people who owe court debt in them. And many, many people owe money in several different jurisdictions, municipal courts and county courts all around the state, often but not always clustered in the geographic area where they live. These jurisdictions do not talk with each other. It was common for people to be on payment plans all over the place. And even when they were expected by each one to pay a relatively small amount, like $25 per jurisdiction, those amounts added up to become unmanageable. Yet the judges who are imposing these only know what they have in front of them. You know, Professor Morgan, you only owe $25 a month. That's not, I have $25. Why don't you have $25? You know, and it's because overall you owe $500 to 12 different jurisdictions each month, and that is unmanageable. So I guess the takeaway of this report is that all of the stuff I just talked about, the historic causes of the racial wealth gap, current enforcement policies, and the everyday realities of people who have court debt add up. And it is the accumulation of these factors that leads poor people to experience court debt as excessive. I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. Some of their faces are on the front of this report. And if you go to our website, there are some videos where they will tell you what their lives are like. I never encountered a poor person who was just refusing to pay because they didn't want to. They were all paying because they couldn't. So that is the population that we are talking about today.
Thank you so much, Leah. And I must say how important the work y'all have done is, and how
Thank you.
how helpful I think it can be to us in helping people understand more about these problems. I'm going to first begin by saying I'm not an expert in this. I think I was asked to talk because recently I have been involved in sort of a two-front battle on some of these issues. First, in a federal case, along with Senator Hank Sanders in Fayette. He came to me and said he had another opportunity for me to serve, as he calls it, and I've never been able to say no to Hank Sanders. So, and then as we progressed with the federal case, we realized, our clients were still in municipal courts. So now we're also representing several clients in municipal court, which has been both of these new experiences for me. I was one of the ones that went into teaching without practice. So I really didn't have any war stories that would have given me more credibility when I taught. Now I'm getting war stories, but I'm not teaching anymore. But I've come to realize I think I am teaching still. I think now I'm trying to teach the judges and lawyers like you. So at least I hope that's happening. Why do this kind of work? I think Mike gave a lot of the reasons, but there's one quote, I don't know who said it, but it stuck with me. It says, "Never work for free unless it gives you something money can't buy." And I think that's what pro bono work in the legal field does for many people. It gives meaning to our lives. Not that much of your paid work may not also, I'm not saying that, but okay, so what I'm going to try to do, there's not a lot of time. Instead, I will try to answer any questions, but I would ask you to hold them unless it's burning till the end, because we don't have a lot of time. And the truth is, what I'm going to say is most of what I know, I think, right now. And so most of your questions I would probably have to answer. I don't know, but I'll try to find out and get back to you. So what I want to do, we've put together jointly a slideshow, and I'm going to run through a little of it. As what I try to do is really just give you what I've learned, or some things that you might do in terms, if you do choose to represent or are already representing clients with criminal court debt in municipal or other courts. But my experience has been in municipal courts. First, can we get it to, do I do that or y'all do?
Just click it right in.
I could if I knew what to do. Oh, okay, here we go, see. All right, so first what I'm gonna just tell you what I have for you on the slides, because there's not time to go all through it. There's some key U.S. Supreme Court cases on debtors prison and imprisoning people who are unable to pay. There's a very recent Supreme Court case many people may not be aware of, called Timms versus Indiana, finding that the Eighth Amendment's excessive fine clause applies to states. We also have a possibly even stronger excessive fines clause in our state constitution. If any of you are out there, we did teach state constitutional law for a little while years ago. I'm not sure anyone does anymore, but look at Timms and let me know if you're able to use it. And one thing maybe we can do is try to keep in touch somewhat through Mike about what people are learning. Two important key constitutional provisions in the Alabama Constitution in this realm is one, as I say, was Article 1, Section 15 on excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment. Also, we have something not found in the federal Constitution at all. There's not a parallel provision. Article 1, Section 20, that no person shall be imprisoned for debt. And so I just point to those. Next, I want to point to you to a very important resource, and really it's the resource that I think most of the rest of this slideshow kind of is based on and pulls out of, but I want to show you what it looks like too. So I added a few slides just to, this is called referred to as the bench card on collections of fines and court costs that is put out under the auspices, at least, of the Supreme Court of Alabama. I think was put together by the Commission on Access to Justice, I believe it's called, but this is a 2-page document, can even be printed 2-sided and be a 1-page document. I'm not giving it a blessing of being completely right in every regard or completely adequate in every regard. I'm not saying that it isn't in most, but I'm just saying it is an extremely valuable document. Print it off, keep it with you, take it, post it on your, everywhere. It pulls this all together in 2 pages, with the last page having, let me just go ahead and show you, that's half the first page. This is the second half of the first page of the permissible things that courts can do, the things they can't do, what they would have to do to impose contempt, which is, at least in my experience, becoming an increasingly serious problem. It's kind of replacing debtor's prison, where you set out your entire debt. Now you sit out 5 days at a time based on findings of contempt. So then there's, the back page goes on further and then has footnotes to the Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure and some of the key Alabama cases and some U.S. cases. So I point you to that as your key resource. The other key resource, of course, is Alabama Rules of Criminal Procedure 2611 on payments and fees and court costs and the things that have to be considered. And I think probably the most important thing an attorney could do would be to insist that the court consider these things. I was in court last Monday with a colleague, and we actually had 4 considerations of ability to pay using at least some of these criteria. And I didn't time it, I wish I had, but I would say it was 20 to 30 minutes. You were there.
Yeah, it was exhaustive.
Each one, and Attorney Fire-Rose Touré did it, who really understands and knows how to ask these questions. But even she and I now know there are other things that could have been asked to give a fuller. So if people really, if defense attorneys and judges would take seriously what should be considered under 2611, it would be remarkable, teaching tool, remarkable tool for understanding just how fines and costs should be shaped to fit the circumstances of individual defendants. The rub, I think, is, if it were done that way, the courts would probably have to come to a stop. They don't have the time to do it. But if we don't have the time to do justice, then we shouldn't be doing anything to these people. And so that's my first point to you, is insist on asking those questions. My experience right now is otherwise there's 2 primary questions that seem to be asked. Are you working, and how much do you make an hour? And then it's presumed, as you say, oh, well, then if you're not paying $25 a month every month and getting down here, even though you don't have a driver's license, and get arrested again to pay it, that you're willfully disobeying this court's order and you're off to jail for 5 days.
And that's really the difference between the wealth gap and the income gap.
Right.
Because you might find a black
Yeah.
person and a white person, or just two people generally making the same income, their wealth is vastly
And
different.
in
We have to
courts-
look at that.
Yeah, in some courts, that I'm not mentioning where I've been practicing, but you can be on more than one payment plan in the same court, because sometimes they won't put you it all together on one payment plan if they
Yes.
don't think you've been behaving correctly. So it's not even trying to keep up with what's in other courts. They never ask about that. Are you on other payment plans or anything? They don't even look at the fact you're on more than one in their court. And I don't mean to be extremely critical, because one thing I wanted to start with saying is that I do see this as kind of trying to teach judges. And I think there are some judges that really want to do the right things in these cases. I think there's some that don't, and it's like everything else in Alabama. You just have to write some people off because we're not going to change them probably over time. But there's some that do, and I think it's the obligation of young and not so young, not so young lawyers, trying to work with those judges that do want to do the right thing and at least try to improve on things where there's some hope, I think. So what else can you do? When you go into municipal court, ask for discovery. Treat it like a real case. Ask for discovery. Ask for accountings of all your clients' payments and every ticket they've been paid on. You may have been waiting 2 years for some of that, but ask for it. Ask for the case files for your clients. Again, I've had some success there. What else can you do? When you're in the hearings themselves, ask the court to reduce or remit or impose no fine, because Rule 2611 says those are available things it can do. Ask them to remove some of the fees and costs that are on your client's records. First of all, sometimes you can get them to remove those incredible, I was told not to say anything off color here, but the 30% DA fees that get tacked on if somebody misses one hearing and gets a failure to appear, even though they tried to reset the hearing. I won't go there, but sometimes you can get those taken off. Multiple court costs. I don't know if this is everywhere, but in one nearby municipality, shall we say, there's a practice of, if you're stopped and if you're poor, you probably, and black mostly, but sometimes poor white, you'll get not one ticket, you get 2, 3, 4 tickets at a time. I've even seen more. And then when you go into court, separate court cost of $158, I think now, are tacked on to all 4 of those. It's against the Alabama law. Look at your bench card. On the front page, it clearly says, and there's a state statute that says for offenses arising out of the same incident shall be considered a case for these purposes. What they argue is this is 5 different cases. Well, it may be on their records, but it's not. The statute defines what a case is for its purposes. And it says the general rule is that you would only pay court costs on the most serious offense. It does give judges some discretion in a particular case not to do that. But the judges, at least many judges, are treating the rule just the other. That the rule is they apply multiple court costs and they may occasionally decide that they want. Read this code section, try to use it. We are. That's Alabama Code 1219 150C, and there's a separate slide that has the full text. I believe it's slide 13. If your clients have been on JCS or Judicial Correction Services probation plans. You know, they've now left the state of Alabama, but many of the tickets that people are still owing on, they set or served probation and even then served debtor's prison time, asked to have those cases taken off. And sometimes you can get it. Ask for community service, but don't ask for it the way it's given right now, which I think is particularly problematic. It's given really as kind of debtors or what am I trying, kind of peonage-based community service where you work off your debt through the hours of community service rather than through the hours spent, you know, sitting in jail. I think that's very problematic. I think community service, just like for rich people, the amount of community service you're given ought to be based on the seriousness of your crime and your ability. And I think I remember recently, and I love this guy's from my home county, Chuck Persons, you know, that the sports guy, there was huge amounts of dollars involved in what he got 200 hours of community service, but poor people get 200 hours of community service for $2,000, not for, you know, hundreds of.
Because it's like
and
$10 an
it's
hour.
$10 an hour. So it's just like debtor's prison, except you're doing it.
It's debtor's convict labor.
Right. So, you know, but appropriately calculated and fairly assessed, I think community service can be a big help. It can't be, no one thing is the silver bullet though. Because if you can't drive or you're having to drive without a license and get arrested on your way to community service, I actually had a client get arrested on, well, it wasn't on his way to court, it was on his way to work when he was coming to court, meeting me in court later that day. But I mean,
Childcare.
yeah, you've got, and you know, some people are already working 2 or 3 jobs, and then to say, well, why can't you do community service? And you get contempt and sent to jail just yesterday. Some people for that. You didn't do your community service. I get a little passionate, I know. All right, a couple of other things, because where are we? Okay, we're still okay. As for the, as I have said, and Leah's research has, a huge problem is losing your driver's licenses or having them suspended or revoked. And at least in the court I'm most familiar with, it's not, there are 2 ways, or more ways you can lose it, of course, but it's not so much, it seems, for failure to pay in full your tickets. And there's been some changes recently that I think will now lead to more payment plans like the court I know does have, that may at least begin further to address some of the loss of driver's license for failure to pay. It's this horrendous regulation that I think has no basis or authority to have been issued that says district courts and municipal courts may, it doesn't say shall, so use this. So you don't have to do this. It's true, it's still there right now, but it says they may, anytime you fail to appear, they may notify the driver's license division and have your license suspended or, and supposedly when you reappear, they're supposed to give a clearance letter and you get it back. But the notice you get, at least at times, really doesn't tell you that. It says when you've settled or paid the cost, you can get your license back. So it's really just a huge mess, but ask for that. Ask them, don't keep sending these just for failure to pay. Talk about disproportionate, I mean, for failure to appear. I'm not saying people shouldn't appear, but would you appear if you know you're likely to spend the next 5 days in jail? If you appear, still, I know people need to appear. I'm not saying they don't, but ask for that. ask for, there's authority under the law, although they don't want to accept it, they can, you can get your license suspended for other things too, like for driving with a suspended license, sort of like suspending people for not coming, but I understand the logic behind that, I guess. But judges in Alabama, at least municipal court judges, I think the statute may specifically say municipal court judges, I'm not sure, it's cited on slide 22, have specific statutory authority to grant limited driving rights, as well as to suspend driving privileges for failure to pay. But ask that. Now what they're going to say to you maybe is, well, we have this new law that gives you ability to get a hardship license. But talk about a hardship. You tried to get a license under that new regulation and law. And that's after many of us worked and got the regulation actually some better than it really was when it was originally put out. But it's not going to be an answer.
Do you know of
You
anybody who's
I
gotten
don't know a
hardship
single
license?
person. If y'all do, let us know.
Please. And if you know people who aren't getting
Right.
them, also let us know,
Exactly.
because
Yeah.
because it's
But-
really important that the state understand that this solution that it thinks is out there is only, as far as I know, is only a solution on paper. It sounds so good.
Yeah.
You can get a
But
hardship
even
license.
if you start looking on paper, it's like, you
Yeah.
still have to pay the reinstatement fee. So if you don't have any money, you can't do that. It lasts 1 year. You might be able to extend it 1 more year if you ask and do all this again. And then this isn't in the regulations, but it's in their application they've developed for it. You have to give them Google Maps of everywhere you might be likely to drive for one of the specified reasons for which you can drive. So it's extremely complicated. It's better than it was, because we at least got them to, before, I think, driving to work and the doctor, they had just things listed they thought men might do. And the first regulation, there was nothing about driving your kids to school or to daycare.
Or even to a job interview. You
right,
could drive
yeah,
to the job
yeah.
you already have.
It
If you
was
want to go to
just-
an interview.
And it was a one-time lifetime thing in the
Yeah,
first
it was
draft.
terrible.
So, we did work, and it is some better. And there may be some people it can actually help, but just beware, it's very limited. It's 1 year. If you're going to keep being poor more than 1 year, it's probably, and then you're going to have to, renew it for 1 more year. And then that's it, apparently. So the driver's license issues, though, are just extremely tied in to all of this and why it continues. What else? I think I'm beginning to, I didn't think I would be able to hit everything I knew, but how little did I know how little I knew and how little time it would take if I raced through it.
We did get one comment that
Okay.
somebody in Huntsville has tried to get a number of the hardship licenses and have been unable to get any of them yet.
Hi, Holly.
Okay, great. That's the kinds of things we need to know. Another thing I brought just for sort of some show and tell, probably a lot of you know about this, but when you're trying to help clients who have driver's license suspended, on the website for the driver's license division, there's a form you can fill out and mail in and find out just everything that's on the record that's keeping them from being able. They send you back a letter. This won't be big enough to show any names, but this is the last ones I've gotten. You have to keep checking for them because people get more and more, but it lists everything that's standing in the way of reinstatement right now. And some of it's not even things from this state, and it's things from other courts within this state, and it may be debts or judgments. So it's much more complicated than it appears it might be to get your license reinstated just through getting clearance letters. But that's one thing you can be aware of and work with clients on. What else was I going to say? Are you getting any other questions or help?
I think someone else had mentioned that one of the benefits of making payment plans people can actually afford is that the municipalities and the state actually get paid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a huge problem. So one of the reasons that all of this is happening is because Alabama funds itself using court debt. A lot of this is imaginary funding because you can't ever collect it because people don't have it. But our state constitution, as we all know, keeps taxes really, really low. And even if the state constitution didn't, right now politically, that is how we roll in Alabama. So courts are funded by fines and fees, but beyond the courts, I think the craziest thing that's funded by fines and fees is the American Village at Montevallo, which is like a little replica of the United States that just exists there. It's really
That's
pretty.
state law, though. You got
That's
to
right.
do in these different
Yeah.
courts, you've got to focus on what that court can
That's
control and things. But yes,
And
it's
then-
a serious problem. Let me mention just a couple of other things, though. Along that point, this has been one possible strategy I've thought about at times since the money is driving this to some extent. Although the truth is, you've got to wonder, they know they're not going to ever collect much of this debt. I think they may use it to kind of have, for municipal budgeting purposes as outstanding debts, or I'm not a budget person, but you know where I'm going. There are things, even if it's not going to be paid, I think it's worthwhile to them to present balanced budgets and things. But it occurred to me, if everybody would just go in, at least if there's a choice of community service, and choose community service rather than a payment plan, they would get nothing. And maybe that would kind of begin to drive some new policies. But
With
there's
the DA
also
fees.
one, just going, and DA fees.
Yeah, so the DA, really quickly, the DA fee, these are often imposed by something called a DART, a District Attorney Asset Recovery Team. They tack on 30% after you've been in arrears for 90 days. And in most places, the DA collects that money off the top. So they'll consolidate everything, even stuff that wasn't originally the DA's purview. They will collect 30% of the totality of what you owe, and they collect it off the top. That is not a rule, though, as far as I know. That is just how it's done. So you could even ask the judge to kind of invert that.
I'm not sure. They will sometimes take off the DA fees now.
Yeah.
There are suits against some of the DA fees pending, but I think there is also statutory authority for it.
There's a statutory authority for the DART, but
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be paid first. It
Yeah.
can be paid. Like, what's really kind of upsetting about it is that if you look at it from a restitution perspective, the last people to get paid are the victims to whom restitution is owed. And the first people that get paid are the collections agency, i.e. the DA's office. I think it's worth mentioning that as much as possible because that's perverse.
Good point. Couple of other things I had here in smaller print. Move to dismiss if the police officers don't show up. Sometimes we've now had them give a third time to call the police officers in one instance I know of, which should not be. If they should be dismissed. If you're, again, this is if you've pled not guilty and the officers don't appear. Another thing related to that, though, is even before pleas, frequently, if you ask for it, if the officers are no longer employed by the police department, they may be willing to dismiss the tickets. So those related points I wanted to add. I think I want to just finish up with, and when I was thinking about this, I was going to finish up, I said, by preaching, but now I realize I've really kind of preached the whole time. So I don't know. This is just kind of my thoughts about, in the long run, what would really have to be done to make significant changes in this area. I think in many cases is what's referred to as forgiveness. And you know, in this state, we talk a lot about forgiveness. We think Black people ought to be able to forgive slavery. They ought to be able to forgive Jim Crow. They ought to be able to forgive lynching. Well, I think it's time we ought to be able to forgive some of the debt that has been placed upon people, not just Black people, but overwhelmingly poor Black people in our municipal and district. And again, y'all can help me know just how wide this is. But through these various practices of stacking tickets, stacking court costs, adding DA fines, doubling the fees if you don't appear, take away your driver's license if you don't appear, so then you're guaranteed, they just sit and arrest you over and over. One defense attorney actually told me, of course they know they can just sit and arrest you. One woman we got out over the weekend because they arrested her taking her kids to school. It was a 3-day weekend. The next Tuesday, she was arrested again taking her kids to school. So I think the only answer, long range in many cases, is forgiveness of much of this debt. And that certainly is within the scope of what judges, the discretion that they have under Rule 2611. I think it's going to ultimately probably have to be done more broadly than just on a case-by-case basis by arguments. But that is sort of my ultimate plea is, you know, let's show some forgiveness from the other side. I guess one other thing, I said I'm going to stop, but one other thing is you can make a tremendous difference. Just, was it Woody Allen? I used to say this in class like it, but I'm not so fond of Woody Allen anymore. I'll say that now, but I think it was him that said like showing up is 90% of life or something. Anyway, just show up in court with a client. And it'll make a tremendous difference, not just in what they may do for that particular client, but if they have computerized dockets and you watch them over the next week or two, it'll make a difference in how seriously they take some of the other cases too. Just to know that there's somebody there that's going to occasionally have the time and take the time to really provide. And I don't mean to, I know that, well, I'm not gonna go there, but just, just going there and being with your client there or a client there can have effects well beyond that individual client's case. And so with that, you asked us to stop about 10 minutes if there are questions or if Leah wants to add more things. I think I've exhausted my knowledge.
Well, I did have one question.
Yeah.
And I think it's a question that we hear a lot from private lawyers. Do you have any advice? You said that you didn't really practice before teaching, and then since you've gone back to the practice of law, I know it was very scary for me the first year walking.
I haven't gone back to the practice of law.
Well,
I'm helping my friends in this case, but please don't send me other cases.
Do you have any advice for new lawyers or lawyers who may feel like they're not ready to do this about jumping in or taking one of these cases? Because it's at least my impression that there really isn't. There's not really any lawyers that don't have to do these.
Yeah. Just do it. Just do it. You couldn't know less about it than I did when I started. And we've made a difference. And last Monday, we had 7 clients with 95 tickets. Now we have 7 clients with 77 tickets because some were taken off. And we reduced by significant amount the total debt that they owe. And we're still having, continuing hearings and things on them. So you can't, even making a little difference for somebody. I mean, the worst you can do is make no difference and they're right where they were anyway. So just go and do it.
Having observed a few of these, so I was there on Monday and I've also been to docket days in a couple of places, which, I mean, they're packed. Everybody shows up to kind of make their case and have their day in court. In one county that I visited, there wasn't even a judge up at the bench, and whenever an attorney did show up for a friend that I connected that attorney with, these two women who I think were just clerks and were making these decisions were so stunned. It didn't result in a difference for that individual that day, but it at least gave them pause. And I think the more that y'all show up and assert that these are folks that may end up in jail. They are entitled to representation. They should have representation. I think that it will make a difference over time. And I mean, as Professor Morgan noted, if they did this right, it would grind the courts to a halt. A true inquiry into what people's financial circumstances are takes a while, and courts should be on notice about that. And you have the power to do that, even if you've never done this before. I would say if you're trying to get to know what someone's financial circumstances look like, the survey at the back of this report is pretty thorough in looking at what they owe and what their income is, and when they get paid and what their other obligations might be. It's not perfect, but I got to know a lot of people that way, and it was a good jumping off point for a conversation. So it might be a way to kind of start a conversation if you're not even sure what questions to ask. These probably are as good as any to get a conversation going with a potential client.
And I would be glad, I'm not in general practice even now, but I would certainly be glad to help anybody, give you any, copies of anything we filed or done if you're wanting to do it. Again, I think just the bench card itself and this, the slides, which are really extensions of the bench card, will give you a lot of information. You'll know more, as I say, than I probably did when I first went. So, but I'm really glad to take questions. My email is mimorgan@yahoo.com. I think I still have a law school email address too, but I don't check it as regularly and it gets filled up. But I would be glad to try to answer or help you if I could. I hope, how many, are there students out there? Do you know former students listening in? Can you tell from the names?
I do not see any of my former class. Some of the people I know are UA graduates.
Good, just wondering.
Well,
Again, if you weren't happy with your grade, I'm sorry, but it's really been good to be here today and to talk with y'all about this.
well, and
What else can we?
One other person said that they suggested, and this is more the volunteer lawyer programs, that it would be nice to have maybe an event to bring either defendants in or lawyers in to talk about this as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think even more broadly, ultimately, as I say, some judges. I think, there are people out there that want to make it better, I think.
The state bar is very concerned about this. I was really heartened to see in their email through the legislative session kind of a note reminding subscribers to the state bar's newsletter that fines and fees are something they're concerned about, and the legislature is concerned about it. It's just a difficult place because of how we have chosen to fund the state of Alabama off the backs of poor people who owe fines and fees. It is complicated. There are difficult incentives to overcome, but the conversation needs to happen. And I think one of the main things we can talk about is that this is all imaginary money. This is never going to be collected. So we're not funding the state this way because there are no funds. But it is something that is the elephant in the room whenever you get to talking with judges or lawmakers about eliminating some of these fees. Is, well, how else will the state fund itself?
But they do get some money out of it.
Some,
as
gosh,
your report
yes.
says, because of these effects. It's like I was amazed to hear that IRS actually goes after poor people because they know how vulnerable they are. They know they don't know their rights. They know they can't afford to have lawyers. So you can scare some money out of them.
Yes, of course.
And they do. And that's why this continues. But as you say, long range,
It's
it
ineffective.
can't be, what it costs to have In one court I know of, you have to come for at least 3 compliance hearings a year, even if you're making every payment. Because truth is, they don't even keep up with the payments until it's time for a compliance hearing, and then they look to see. They could easily computerize and at least not call people in as long as they're up on their payments, but it doesn't matter. And some of these people will be coming in for 10 or 20 years. Because if you think about it, for a $25 payment plan, you'll pay off $300 a year. And we have people who owe $10,000
That's
or
not-
$15,000. They'll be coming for a minimum of 3. And once you start missing, you come in maybe once a week. It's really almost like JCS has moved into the
Right, and
municipal
that would
courts.
be
You come
9
in
years.
3 days, you
That would be 9 years. So if
Yeah.
it's $300 a year, that would be 9 years on the $2,700 median network.
right, your median, which you said, oh, well, that's not much.
I mean, it's
But
not
think about
like-
it, that's 9
Yeah.
years of payments. If you made every payment.
Yep.
Well, I think we are about out of time, which is great. We did have, I'm going to link back to what I said during the introduction, which is that if this sounds like a great job, if you're very interested in these issues, Legal Services Alabama is hiring a new attorney to deal with just these issues, nothing else, just court debt around the state.
That's
got-
gonna be wonderful.
We got funding.
Apply.
We got money from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it'll be great. It's a large travel budget, by the way. You get to see 67 counties.
Beautiful Alabama.
But I think it's going to be a great chance to change the state for the better. And so we are taking applications on that through Friday. You apply by either going to the Legal Services website, you can see the job there, or just email an application at jobs@alsp.org. Or you can just, I think my emails and all the things that got sent out, you can just contact me for more information. We did have one question about how would you find clients? If like a pro bono attorney wanted to find a
Oh,
client.
well, go to a docket day. So go to a payment docket day down in your local downtown municipal court or the district court. You can call up and find out when they have compliance hearings. I went to one in a nearby county. It was like church on Christmas. Each one of the people that was packing that courtroom could have been a client. I'm sure they would all have been happy to see you.
Yeah. The only thing
And I don't know the rules on that anymore. It's been so long. I haven't had any trouble. They've come to me.
I think you are free to solicit in Alabama because that'd be soliciting under the ethics rules, but you are allowed to solicit for pro bono work. You can't
Okay.
solicit for pay. You couldn't go to a docket, a regular docket and stand there, but you can go to do it for free. But if you have any questions, you can email me. Legal Services, very excited to be working on this, and thanks Professor Morgan and Leah.
I will also find you clients.
Yes, that's true. I think if you call Leah or SPLC, they would just gladly send you people.
You clients.
Anyway, I think we are at time, so I appreciate it and hope everyone enjoyed it. And look forward to seeing you at our next monthly webinar sometime in August. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.